Alright, let's go. Number 10. The papyri that weren't supposed to be raidable. In 1752, workers tunneling beneath volcanic rock at Herculaneum broke into a room lined with what looked like blackened firewood, stacked in racks. They were carbonized scrolls, over 1,000 of them, sealed inside the Via dei Papyri when Vesuvius buried the town in 79 CE. Several were burned for fuel before anyone realized what they were. The ones that survived crumbled to ash the moment anyone tried to unroll them. For 270 years, that was the end of the story. The scrolls sat in Naples, catalogued, photographed, and functionally unreadable. Too fragile to open, their carbonized surfaces a uniform, black on black, ink indistinguishable from papyrus to the naked eye. Then in 2015, Brent Seals, a computer scientist at the University of Kentucky, demonstrated that a related sealed scroll from En-Gedi in Israel could be read without unrolling it at all, using CT scanning and software that mapped the papyrus's buried surface into a flattened, readable image. The same technique on the Herculaneum material produced nothing but noise. The ink used at Herculaneum was carbon-based, chemically almost identical to the carbonized papyrus around it. The scan couldn't find the letters. What Seals's team would eventually find inside that noise would take 8 more years, a public prize fund, and people who had never opened an ancient manuscript in their lives. The scrolls themselves are not uniform. Some are tightly wound and relatively intact, roughly the diameter of a fist. Others were crushed flat by the same pyroclastic surge that carbonized them, their layers fused together into something closer to a lump of coal than a readable document, a physical state that 18th century conservators, working with knives and heated wire, simply could not open without destroying whatever text survived inside. In March 2023, entrepreneurs Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross launched the Vesuvius Challenge, a competition offering cash prizes to anyone who could extract readable text from the scanned scrolls using machine learning. In October, Luke Ferreter, an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska, trained a model that detected a faint textural signature the ink left in the papyrus fibers, not visible but statistically present, and used it to surface the first word, purple. In February 2024, Ferreter, Yusuf Nader, and Julian Schilliger split the challenge's grand prize after reconstructing more than 2,000 characters from a single scroll, revealing a work of Epicurean philosophy, likely by Philodemus, debating the nature of pleasure. Consider the implication. The library at Herculaneum was destroyed instantly and completely, and that destruction is the only reason any of it survived at all. Nothing about that process was designed to preserve information. It preserved it anyway, sealed inside carbon for 2 millennia, waiting on a form of computing that didn't exist for 265 of those years. The Gospel of Luke describes it in a different context entirely. Nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, nothing concealed that will not be brought to light. But the phrase fits a library that was never meant to be read again. An estimated 800 to 1,100 scrolls from the villa's main collection have never been excavated. They remain under a modern residential building in the town of Ercolano, whose owners have not agreed to demolition. The Biblioteca Nazionale di Napoli holds the scrolls that were recovered in the 18th century, still rolled, still black, most of them still unscanned. The rest of the library, if it exists, is still down there. Before number 9, if you want the full paper trail behind claims like these, the sources, the excavation reports, the manuscript references, all of it's laid out in the evidence ebook linked in the description below. Number 9. The Skulls That Fooled the World's Best Museums. In 1992, an anonymous package arrived at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Inside was a life-sized human skull carved from a single block of milky quartz, along with an unsigned note claiming it was Aztec, purchased in Mexico in 1960. Jane McLaren Walsh, the museum's Mesoamerican specialist, turned the object over in her hands and noticed something wrong before she'd even reached for a microscope. Real Aztec skull imagery was carved crudely from basalt. Nothing about this object matched anything she had ever excavated. Walsh spent the next 16 years building a case, examining acquisition records, comparing carving styles against securely provenanced Aztec and Mixtec stonework, recovered from documented excavation contexts, and finding no genuine pre-Columbian precedent anywhere for a life-sized skull carved from a single block of clear quartz. In 2008, she and a team of British and American researchers published their findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science, having examined both the Smithsonian skull and the British Museum's own crystal skull, acquired in 1897 from Tiffany & Co. Under scanning electron microscopy, both skulls showed fine, perfectly parallel striations, the signature of a rotary wheel, not a hand tool. Embedded in the grooves of both objects, the team found microscopic traces of carborundum, a synthetic industrial abrasive that was not invented until the 1890s. No pre-Columbian artisan carved these skulls, because no pre-Columbian artisan had access to a jeweler's lathe. For decades before that study, these skulls were displayed and discussed as authentic pre-Columbian artifacts, Aztec, Mixtec. Sometimes Maya, objects credited by some researchers and popular writers with unusual physical or psychic properties. The trail Walsh followed backward through museum acquisition ledgers kept leading to the same 19th century name, Eugne Boban, a French antiquities dealer who spent years in Mexico before setting up shop in Paris, selling crystal skulls to collectors as genuine Aztec relics. Boban had exhibited a crystal skull at the 1867 Paris Exposition Universelle. He later sold stock to the American mineralogist George Coons, who sold one skull onto Tiffany & Co., which in turn sold it to the British Museum in 1897, with Tiffany's own reputation vouching for its authenticity. The provenance looked respectable precisely because it had passed through respectable hands, none of whom had ever independently traced where Boban had originally sourced it. The most famous of them, the Mitchell Hedges skull, came with a discovery story, found in 1924 by 17-year-old Anna Mitchell Hedges, inside a collapsed altar at the Maya site of Lubanton, Belize. Walsh's research into the paper trail told a different story. The skull surfaces in a 1943 Sotheby's auction catalog, purchased there by Anna's father, Frederick Mitchell Hedges, 19 years after the supposed jungle discovery, and with no excavation record connecting it to Lubanton at all. Walsh later documented that Frederick Mitchell Hedges had known Boban's associates and had likely acquired the skull through that same dealer network, then built a more romantic origin story around it decades afterward. What makes this particularly unsettling isn't that the skulls are fake. It's that some of the world's most rigorous scientific institutions displayed manufactured 19th century curiosities as genuine pre-Columbian sacred objects for the better part of a century. And it took a jeweler's question. What tool made these marks? Asked under an electron microscope to end it. Isaiah 44 describes a craftsman cutting wood, shaping it with a blade, and then bowing down to what his own hands made, unable to recognize the deception even as he holds it. The skulls weren't ancient gods. They were Idar Oberstein lapidary work, sold into a market hungry enough for the miraculous that nobody thought to ask a machinist. The Smithsonian skull now sits in curatorial storage, cataloged as a 19th century European carving. The British Museum's skull remains on view in Room 1. Its label reads, 19th century, probably European. Visitors still stop in front of the case and photograph it like it's something else. Number 8. The mummy board the British Museum won't loan out. In 1889, a British traveler named Arthur F. Wheeler purchased an ornately painted wooden mummy board in Luxor, the gilded, face-bearing lid that sat over an Egyptian coffin, and donated it to the British Museum, where it was catalogued as EA 22542, believed to depict an unnamed priestess connected to the temple of Amun. It entered the collection quietly. It did not stay quiet. The story that grew up around its sale names 4 young Englishmen present at the original transaction in Luxor, and claims each of them suffered some documented misfortune shortly afterward. One lost an arm, another was financially ruined, a third returned home to find his house had burned, A fourth reportedly died within the year. None of this appears in any museum acquisition record. It survives only as travelers' folklore repeated in newspaper retellings, embellished with each printing. The kind of story that accumulates specificity precisely because nobody involved is alive to contradict it. The board itself is worth pausing on, because it is not, strictly speaking, a mummy at all. There is no body inside it, and none was ever recorded as accompanying it. It is the painted gilded coffin lid that once sat over a burial, carved and decorated with a wide-eyed, direct-facing stare unusual for Egyptian funerary art of the period, which typically depicted the deceased in profile or with a more composed downward gaze. The unnamed priestess it depicts has never been identified. Nobody knows her name, her lineage, or the burial the board was originally removed from before 4 young Englishmen encountered it for sale in a Luxor bazaar, and Wheeler bought it home. Egyptologists who have studied the piece note that its craftsmanship is genuinely fine, careful gilding, precise hieroglyphic columns. The kind of quality reserved for a family who could afford real ceremony for their dead, which only deepens the puzzle of why her name was never recorded anywhere the museum has been able to trace. By 1904, journalist William T. Stead was recounting stories at London dinner parties about a cursed Egyptian relic tied to a string of misfortunes among its various handlers, accidents, sudden illness. A photographer who reportedly died shortly after photographing it, its glass plate image supposedly developing a distorted, screaming version of the priestess's painted face. Stead himself drowned aboard the Titanic in 1912, and the retelling absorbed him into the legend. Some versions of the story eventually claimed the mummy board had been smuggled aboard the ship itself and gone down with it, or that Stead had been carrying a photograph of it in his cabin when the ship struck the iceberg. British museum records are unambiguous on this point. The object has remained in the museum's possession continuously since 1889. It was never on the Titanic. It never left Britain. That correction doesn't end the story, because the fear it generated was never really about the artifact's travel itinerary. Museum staff have fielded public anxiety about the object for over a century. Visitors asking to have it removed from display, letters expressing concern about handling it, informal accounts of the museum being wary of lending it to other institutions given the reputation attached to the catalog number. The museum's own public-facing materials now address the legend directly. Correcting the Titanic claim by name, an institution formally rebutting a rumor about a painted board of wood and gesso, because the rumor never stopped generating mail, more than a century after the object first walked through the door. What makes this genuinely strange isn't the curse. It's that a piece of religious funerary art, manufactured to honor an anonymous woman's passage into the afterlife 3,000 years ago, generated enough documented dread in a scientific institution that the institution felt compelled to answer it in writing, and continues fielding the same questions from visitors more than a century after Wheeler carried it out of Luxor in a crate. No formal apology has ever been issued for the decades the legend was allowed to circulate unchallenged in print. No curator has ever gone on record explaining why a wooden coffin lid with no body attached to it became one of the most feared objects in the museum's collection. The correction lives in a paragraph on a website few visitors ever read before they walk into room 62, still half expecting to feel something. Number 7. The Mummy Whose Scream Turned Out to Be a Murder Confession. In 1886, French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, director of Egypt's Antiquities Service, unwrapped a mummy recovered from a hidden royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, a mass reburial site where priests had secretly relocated dozens of looted royal mummies in antiquity to protect them. The cache, designated DB320, had not been found by archaeologists first. It had been found and quietly looted for a decade by a local family, the Abd el-Rasuls, who sold artifacts from it piecemeal on the black market before Egyptian authorities traced the source and forced its formal excavation in 1881. By the time Maspero worked through the recovered bodies in his Cairo Museum laboratory 5 years later, most of the royal mummies inside had already been catalogued, named, and matched to known pharaohs. One body resisted every attempt at identification. Every other body from that cache had been carefully rewrapped and labeled by the ancient priests who moved them, complete with linen dockets recording whose remains lay inside. This one had not. As Maspero peeled back the final layer of linen, the mouth was locked open, the facial muscles contorted into what looked, unmistakably, like a scream. He recorded his own unease in the excavation notes. Nothing else in the cache looked like this. Later museum conservators who x-rayed the body found further irregularities beneath the wrappings. Internal organs left in place rather than removed through the standard embalming incision. No resin poured into the body cavity. None of the careful preservation techniques applied to every other mummy recovered from the same hiding place. The body carried no name, no inscription, no royal titles, a deliberate erasure in a culture that considered the preservation of a person's name essential to their survival in the afterlife. He had been wrapped not in linen alone, but partly in sheepskin, a material ancient Egyptians considered ritually impure. Whoever buried him wanted him both physically preserved and spiritually punished at the same time. Egyptologists began calling him simply Unknown Man E. The case sat unresolved for over a century. Early theories ranged widely: a foreign prisoner of war executed and dumped into the royal cache by accident, a poisoning victim, someone struck by a fatal illness mid-mummification before embalmers could finish setting his features. None of the theories could be tested without the kind of imaging technology that did not exist in Maspero's lifetime, or in the lifetime of the Egyptologists who inherited the mystery after him. For over a century, the body sat in storage, examined periodically, photographed, occasionally displayed, and never conclusively explained. Then in 2012, a team led by Zahi Hawass published a study in the BMJ combining CT imaging with genetic testing on the mummy of Ramesses III and several candidates from the same royal cache, examining a body long suspected of dying under violent or forced circumstances. The CT scans confirmed Ramesses III's throat had been cut, ending decades of scholarly debate about the cause of his death. The genetic analysis went further. Unknown Man E carried a Y chromosome profile consistent with being Ramesses III's son. The historical record supplies the rest. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin documents a palace conspiracy, the Harem Conspiracy, in which one of Ramesses III's secondary wives plotted with palace officials to assassinate the king and install her own son on the throne instead of the legitimate heir. Multiple conspirators, tried and convicted, were forced to commit suicide rather than executed outright, a punishment that denied them a proper death and, by extension, a proper afterlife. One of the condemned went by a substitute name recorded in the trial documents rather than his own, a formal erasure of identity as part of the sentence. But here's where the science outran the myth for a century of Egyptologists. The screaming face was never supernatural. It was rigor and asphyxiation, most likely from strangulation or forced poisoning. On a body denied the embalming rites that would have relaxed and composed it before burial. The last physical evidence of a coup that very nearly ended a pharaoh's dynasty from inside his own household. Psalm 109 asks that a guilty man's name be blotted out and forgotten. Someone in the 20th dynasty granted that curse to a living son. Unknown Man E remains in storage at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, rarely displayed. Genetics has given him back his father. No inscription has ever given him back his own name. Number 6. The 165-pound Bible with the devil's portrait inside. In the final days of the 30 Years' War, in 1648, Swedish troops under General Hans Christoph von Nigsmark seized the library of Prague Castle as war spoils and loaded its contents onto wagons bound for Stockholm. Among the crates was a single manuscript so large it required 2 men to lift it, bound in wooden boards, weighing roughly 165 pounds. Made from the skins of an estimated 160 animals. It survives today as the largest medieval manuscript in the world, the Codex Gigas, the Giant Book, more infamously known as the Devil's Bible. Its cover boards alone are roughly a meter tall, thick enough that the completed volume needs both arms to lift rather than one hand to turn. Paleographers who have examined the text agree on something remarkable: the entire 310-leaf manuscript, the complete Vulgate Bible, the historical writings of Josephus, medical treatises drawn from classical sources, Isidore of Seville's Encyclopedic Etymologiae, a local chronicle of Bohemia, a calendar with a necrology listing the deaths of monks at Podlace, and a set of exorcism rites. Appears to have been copied by a single scribe's hand throughout. A project manuscript historian's estimate would have taken roughly 5 years of continuous, uninterrupted labor to complete alone. Monastic tradition holds it was produced at the Benedictine monastery of Podlace in Bohemia in the early 13th century. The legend that grew up around it says a monk sentenced to be walled up alive for breaking his vows offered his abbot one impossible bargain: a book glorifying the monastery for all time, finished in a single night, in exchange for his life. When dawn approached and the work was unfinished, the story goes, he turned to Lucifer for help completing it, which is why. On a page facing a full-page illumination of the heavenly Jerusalem, the manuscript contains a solitary full-page portrait of the devil, crouched, horned, and staring outward at the reader. Before the manuscript's brief 2007 return to Prague, conservators at the National Library of Sweden carried out an extended physical examination, multispectral imaging of the parchment and ink, close analysis of page-by-page consistency in letter forms and line spacing, to confirm the book could survive transport at all. The same examination reinforced what paleographers had suspected for over a century: no seams, no shifts in hand, no evidence that a second or third scribe had ever picked up where another left off. Whoever made it started at the first page and did not stop until the last one. Calendar, exorcisms, gospels, and devil portrait alike, all in the same disciplined hand. The scribe never explains the juxtaposition in his own writing, but the compositional choice matches a structure familiar to anyone who has read to the end of Revelation, judgment rendered, and immediately afterward. The New Jerusalem Descending, chapters 20 and 21, laid out as one continuous sequence rather than two separate visions. Whoever laid out those two facing pages made a deliberate editorial choice about how a reader should encounter judgment and paradise together, on the same opening, in the same glance, an illustrated argument about divine order embedded inside a book that had every reason, given its size and cost, to prioritize efficiency over theological commentary. The manuscript's necrology adds a detail easy to miss inside a 165-pound book. It lists the deaths of the monastery's own brothers, year by year, a running record of the community that produced the codex, slowly losing its own members even as the project it commissioned outlived every one of them. Whoever the scribe was, tradition never records his name. The book he spent roughly 5 years of his life copying by hand has survived him by nearly 8 centuries. What makes the legend durable isn't that anyone seriously believes a monk conjured Lucifer to finish his homework. It's that the single-hand analysis holds up. No scriptorium of a dozen monks. No handoff between multiple scribes working in relay, which would have made the achievement unremarkable and explainable. One person, one hand, one impossibly long unbroken effort, the kind of achievement that, lacking a rational explanation anyone in the 13th century found satisfying, got assigned a supernatural one instead. The Codex Gigas has left Sweden exactly once since 1648, a 3-month loan back to Prague in 2007, transported under armed escort and insured for a sum few museums anywhere could match. It went back to Stockholm afterward. It has not left the country since. Quick pause before we keep going. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. It makes a real difference for a channel like this. And if you've got to guess which one's landing at number 1, put it in the comments. I read every single one. Number 5. The box that put AN Antiquities Collector on trial for 7 years. In the spring of 2002, French paleographer André Lemaire of the École Pratique des Hautes Etudes in Paris sat at a table in the Tel Aviv apartment of antiquities collector Oded Golan, running his fingers along an inscription cut into a weathered limestone bone box. Golan had owned it for years, purchased, he claimed, from an Arab dealer sometime in the 1970s, and had never thought much of the Aramaic lettering along one side. Lemaire recognized the words instantly. Translated, they read, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Lemaire published the find in Biblical Archaeology Review that November, and by October, the ossuary was on public display at the Royal Ontario Museum, billed as the first archaeological object potentially connected by name to the family of Jesus of Nazareth. If genuine in its entirety, it would be the only surviving physical artifact naming him at all. The claim tests something the New Testament already states independently in two separate places. Mark's Gospel lists James among Jesus' brothers by name, and Paul in Galatians refers in passing to meeting James, whom he calls the Lord's brother. The ossuary added no new information to the historical record. It offered, if authentic, a piece of first-century limestone confirming a detail already sitting in plain text. Golan later told reporters he had owned the box for decades without any idea what the inscription meant in a Christian context. He said he had not registered that the New Testament described Jesus as having a brother at all, and had no reason to connect the Hebrew name on a stone box to the English name James used in translated Bibles. Some scholars, including Israeli archaeologist Amos Kloner, publicly raised the possibility that the ossuary might have originated from the Talpiot tomb complex excavated in Jerusalem in 1980, a different controlled excavation whose own ossuaries carry a separate set of inscribed names. Golan denied any connection, and no physical evidence has ever tied the two together. The question of where, precisely, the box came from before it reached his collection has never been resolved. The case against it seemed to close almost immediately. In 2003, a committee convened by the Israel Antiquities Authority concluded that while the box itself was ancient, the second half of the inscription, Brother of Jesus, had been carved recently into an authentic surface and coated in a fabricated patina to simulate age. The announcement was treated internationally as a scandal resolved. A wealthy private collector had allegedly manufactured the most significant biblical artifact of the decade, and the scientific establishment had caught him. Adad Golan was indicted in 2004 on forgery charges tied to the ossuary and several other disputed artifacts, accused by prosecutors of running an operation sophisticated enough to have seeded fabricated antiquities into museum collections worldwide. The trial that followed ran for 7 years, 138 witnesses, more than 400 exhibits, a transcript exceeding 12,000 pages. One of the longest criminal trials in Israeli judicial history, a proceeding a judge, on the record, would later describe as unlike anything an Israeli criminal court had handled before, moving between paleography, chemistry, rainfall records, and the Aramaic grammar of the 1st century within a single week of testimony. Then the case reopened itself from inside the courtroom. Defense experts, including geologist Wolfgang Krumbein, testified that the patina across the disputed portion of the inscription was chemically consistent with the rest of the box, not a modern addition at all. Testimony also emerged that police forensic handling of the ossuary may have contaminated the surface, compromising any further scientific testing. In March 2012, Judge Aharon Farkash of the Jerusalem District Court acquitted Golan of every forgery charge, ruling across 474 pages that the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt, while carefully declining to declare the inscription genuine either. Consider the implication. 9 years of state investigation and 7 years of trial did not settle whether the most significant physical object ever connected to the historical Jesus is real. It settled only that no one, not the Antiquities Authority, not the state prosecution, not the defense's own experts, could prove the answer either way inside a courtroom. The ossuary was returned to Golan in November 2013, a full decade after police first seized it from his collection. No museum has displayed it publicly since the trial began. It remains in private hands, unavailable to outside scholars without his permission, its second sentence still legally neither confirmed nor disproven. Sitting somewhere in Tel Aviv in a private collector's storage rather than behind glass anywhere a scholar could simply walk up and look at it. Number 4. the stone no scientist has ever been allowed to test. In 930 C, an army of Karmatians, a radical breakaway Ismaili sect based in eastern Arabia, stormed Mecca during the Hajj pilgrimage, slaughtered thousands of pilgrims inside the sanctuary itself, and pried the sacred black stone directly out of the eastern corner of the Kaaba. Islamic chronicles, including the histories of Al-Tabari and later Ibn Kathir, record that the raiders carried it back to their stronghold at Al-Asa and held it there for over 2 decades, using its absence as leverage against the Abbasid Caliphate, before finally returning it, reportedly under a substantial ransom in 951. When it was reinstalled, it came back broken into several fragments, cracked apart either during the theft or the intervening years in captivity. It has remained fractured ever since, the pieces held together inside a silver frame, embedded roughly 1.5 meters above the ground in the Kaaba's southeastern corner. No chronicle from the period records the raiders offering, or anyone requesting, a single scholarly examination of the stone during the more than 20 years it sat outside Mecca's control, an opportunity. Had anyone treated it as a specimen rather than a hostage that vanished as completely as the century that produced it? That silver-bound, fractured stone is what over 2 million pilgrims a year now reach out to touch or kiss during Hajj, making it, by any reasonable measure, one of the most physically handled sacred objects on earth. And it is also one of the least scientifically examined. Non-Muslims are barred by Saudi law from entering Mecca at all. The stone itself has never been sampled, cut, or removed for independent laboratory analysis by any outside geological institution in the entire modern era of mineralogy. The widely repeated claim that it is a meteorite has circulated for centuries, but it remains exactly that, a claim, resting on physical description and tradition rather than laboratory confirmation. Because no confirmation has ever been permitted. Danish astronomer Elsebeth Thomsen, working from the University of Copenhagen, published an analysis in the early 1980s arguing against the meteorite hypothesis entirely, suggesting from available photographs and historical descriptions that the stone's texture and color pattern were more consistent with agate, or a terrestrial volcanic rock, than with any known meteorite composition. Her conclusion could not be tested against a physical sample, because none existed outside Mecca and none was made available to her. Islamic tradition offers its own account of the stone's condition. It is said to have descended from heaven pure white, and to have darkened over the centuries by absorbing the sins of the pilgrims who touched it, a devotional explanation for the same fractured, blackened surface that a geologist would attribute to age, handling, and repeated exposure to fire from the many attempts across history to damage or seize it. Multiple outside requests for even a small physical sample are known to have been made and declined over the past century. The honest scientific answer is that no one outside the stone's Saudi custodians has ever been in a position to know its true composition for certain. The idea of a sacred stone believed to have descended from the heavens is not unique to Mecca. Genesis 28 describes Jacob setting up a stone pillar at Bethel after a night of visions, anointing it with oil, and naming the site the House of God, one instance of a broader ancient Near Eastern practice of venerating standing stones, or bedels, as physical points of contact between earth and the divine, a practice scholars of the region have documented across multiple cultures and centuries. From Nabatean Petra to pre-Islamic Arabian shrines that predate Muhammad's own lifetime by generations. The Kaaba itself was a site of pilgrimage and stone veneration before Islam formalized around it, housing multiple sacred objects in the pre-Islamic period before the black stone alone was retained as the structure's focal point. That deeper history is acknowledged within Islamic tradition itself rather than hidden from it, but it does nothing to open the stone to outside verification. If anything, the acknowledged antiquity of the site raises the stakes on the unanswered mineralogical question rather than resolving it. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the absence of a meteorite classification. It's that the restriction has never once been broken. Every other artifact on this list was eventually researched, sued over, scanned, leaked, or smuggled into a lab somewhere. This stone has been examined by the eyes and lips of pilgrims for 14 centuries, and by scientific instruments never. It sits exactly where the Carmatians eventually returned it in 951, fractured, silver-bound. Touched by more human hands each year than any other object on the planet, and analyzed under laboratory conditions by exactly none of them. Number 3. The tomb that killed the man who paid for it. On November 26, 1922, Howard Carter knelt in front of a sealed doorway deep in the Valley of the Kings, chipped a small hole through the plaster, and held a candle up to the gap. The flame wavered in the escaping air that had been sealed inside for over 3,000 years, and Carter stood there for a long moment, unable to immediately describe what the flickering light was showing him. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon, who had funded years of fruitless digging on the promise of exactly this moment, waited for an answer. Lord Carnarvon did not live to see the tomb fully cleared. On April 5, 1923, roughly 4.5 months after the doorway came down, he died in Cairo of blood poisoning, traced to an infected mosquito bite he had nicked open while shaving. The press seized on the timing immediately. Novelist Marie Corelli published a widely circulated warning about ancient curses striking those who violated sealed Egyptian tombs, and over the following years, a growing list of deaths, some connected to the excavation, many not, was folded into the legend of the pharaoh's curse. Among the names later swept into the story was the American railroad heir George J. Gould. Reported by newspapers of the period to have fallen ill shortly after visiting the tomb and died the following year, a correlation newspapers were quick to publicize and quick to leave uninvestigated any further. Howard Carter himself lived another 17 years after the opening, dying in London in 1939 of lymphoma, a detail curse chroniclers have generally had to leave out of the narrative or explain away, since the man who physically broke the seal first should, by the story's own logic, have been the first to fall. In 2002, epidemiologist Mark Nelson of Monash University decided to test the legend directly. Using Howard Carter's own diaries, Nelson identified the 25 Westerners documented as present when the tomb's sealed inner doors were breached, and a comparison group of 19 Westerners who were in Egypt at the time but not present at that breach. Nelson tracked down obituaries for every name he could find, established each person's age at death, and ran the numbers the way any epidemiologist would evaluate exposure to a suspected toxin or pathogen. The exposed group's average age at death came out to 70. The unexposed group's average age at death came out to 75. A difference numerically in the opposite direction from what the curse legend predicted, and statistically indistinguishable from chance either way. Tracking each person's date of death, Nelson found no statistically significant difference in survival between the two groups, an odds ratio of 1.38, with a confidence interval wide enough to include no effect at all. Published in the BMJ's Christmas issue, the study effectively closed the case. There was no curse. There was, statistically, nothing to explain. Except the case was not closed, because a separate and much stranger body of evidence was accumulating from an entirely different tomb, one that had nothing to do with Egypt at all. In 1973, a 12-person Polish research team opened the 500-year-old tomb of King Casimir IV Jagiellon at Wawel Cathedral in Krakow for conservation work, prying open a wooden coffin that had rotted around the king's remains inside a chamber sealed since 1492. Within days, 4 of the 12 were dead. Over the following months and years, several more followed, until as many as 10 of the original 12 conservators had died, some from infections that set in almost immediately, others from strokes and illnesses that emerged over the following years. Microbiologist Bolesław Smyk tested samples taken from inside the tomb and identified Aspergillus flavus, along with 2 related Penicillium species, thriving throughout the sealed chamber. A fungus that produces aflatoxins capable of causing fatal liver damage and lung infection, particularly in anyone with a weakened immune system or prior exposure to cancer treatment. Smyk himself, one of the 2 members of the original team to survive, later reported years of ongoing health problems he attributed to his own exposure. The same species has since been documented in multiple long-sealed Egyptian tombs, including material recovered from the mummy of Ramesses II. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the curse Nelson debunked. It's the hazard his statistics never addressed. Nelson's study proved no supernatural pattern followed Carter's expedition. It says nothing about whether the physical air inside a chamber sealed for 3,000 years is safe to breathe. Sealed tombs, Egyptian and otherwise, do measurably harbor pathogenic fungal spores capable of killing an exposed and vulnerable person within weeks. The word curse was always the wrong word. The word contaminated was always available, and for decades, nobody reached for it. Carnarvon's death has no toxicology report to confirm or rule out fungal exposure. The diagnosis of blood poisoning from his shaving cut predates any such testing. What remains undisputed is only this: he entered a sealed chamber that had not exchanged air with the outside world in 3 millennia, and within months, he was dead. Number 2. The spear Hitler moved under military guard. In March 1938, days after German troops crossed into Austria in the Anschluss, Adolf Hitler traveled to Vienna and stood in front of a display case in the Hofburg Palace's treasury. Looking at an ornate iron spearhead, bound in gold and silver bands, the Holy Lance, venerated for centuries as the weapon a Roman soldier used to pierce the side of the crucified Jesus. An episode recorded only in the Gospel of John, chapter 19. Within months, Hitler ordered the entire Habsburg imperial regalia, the spear included, packed under military escort and transported out of Austria to Nuremberg, a symbolic relocation returning the relic to the German city most closely associated with the Holy Roman Empire's coronation ceremonies centuries earlier. It was displayed briefly there before being sealed inside an underground bunker beneath Nuremberg Castle for the remainder of the war, hidden along with the rest of the imperial treasures as Allied bombing intensified over the city. American forces searching the ruins after Germany's surrender initially could not locate the regalia at all. The objects had been moved and resealed more than once in the war's final months, and it took direct interrogation of surviving Nuremberg city officials before American General George Patton's 7th Army located and recovered the collection in 1945. It was returned to Vienna the following year and has remained in the Hofburg treasury since. The single relocation of 1938, the only time in roughly 1,000 years of documented custody that the spear left Austrian soil under the direct order of a head of state. The spear's association with power runs back centuries before Hitler. Medieval and early modern emperors of the Holy Roman Empire carried it into battle and coronation alike. Treating physical possession of the relic as a marker of divinely sanctioned rule, a belief specific enough that several emperors are recorded refusing to enter combat without it nearby. Its documented history traces to the reign of Otto I in the mid-10th century, and some historians connect its earlier medieval provenance to the regalia of the Lombard kings of northern Italy. Later seized into Frankish hands after Charlemagne's conquest of the Lombard kingdom in the late 8th century. It's claimed history goes back nearly 1,000 years further than that, to a soldier the Gospel of John never names, but whom later Christian tradition, beginning with the apocryphal Acts of Pilate, a non-canonical text not included in the New Testament, identifies as a Roman centurion called Longinus. Popular treatment of the Vienna Spear's 20th century history rests heavily on a 1972 book, The Spear of Destiny, by British writer Trevor Ravenscroft, which claimed Hitler had been personally obsessed with the relic since youth, believing it granted its possessor the power to shape world history, and that Hitler had discussed this obsession at length with an occultist named Walter Johannes Stein. Subsequent historians examining Ravenscroft's sourcing found that key claims, including detailed private conversations he attributed to Stein, could not be corroborated and appeared to be dramatized or invented outright. Serious historians of the Nazi period now treat Ravenscroft's account as unreliable popular mythology rather than documented history. What survives that reassessment is narrower, and stranger for being smaller, the verified military record that Hitler's government did, in fact, orchestrate the armed removal of this specific relic from Vienna within months of the Anschluss. Regardless of what Hitler privately believed about it. In January 2003, metallurgist Robert Feather was granted unusual access to examine the spear directly, permitted to remove the delicate gold and silver bands holding it together and run X-ray diffraction and fluorescence testing on the bare iron underneath. His conclusion, later supported by a separate 1914 analysis from the Montan University of Leoben in Austria that had reached a similar range independently, dated the spearhead's manufacture to no earlier than the 7th century, a full 600 years after the crucifixion, and consistent instead with Lombard or early Frankish metalwork. A small iron nail embedded in the blade, long venerated as one of the actual nails of the crucifixion, tested as consistent in length and shape with a 1st century Roman nail, meaning that at some later date, a genuinely ancient Roman nail may have been fused into a medieval spearhead, manufacturing a relic's authenticity out of 2 separate objects from 2 entirely different centuries. What makes this particularly unsettling isn't the dating gap by itself, it's the deliberateness the gap implies. Someone, centuries after the crucifixion, took an object old enough to be convincing and combined it with a spearhead new enough to be usable as regalia, building a relic engineered from the start to be venerated rather than a relic that simply survived. The forgery, if that's the right word for a medieval act of devotion, worked well enough to convince a line of Holy Roman emperors to build their claim to divinely sanctioned rule partly around it, and worked well enough, 14 centuries later, to obsess a regime that spent a war moving it under armed guard rather than risk losing it. The Kunsthistorisches Museum, which now oversees the treasury, has never issued a statement retracting the relic's traditional 1st century attribution, even though its own commissioned research places the spearhead 600 years too late to have touched the body it is venerated for touching. The label beside the case still calls it the Holy Lance. It does not mention Robert Feather. It does not mention the 7th century. It is never needed to. The crowds keep lining up regardless of what the museum's own scientists found underneath the gold. Number 1. The cloth that spends 362 days a year locked away. Inside the Camara Santa of Oviedo Cathedral in northern Spain sits a folded, blood-stained linen cloth roughly the size of a large handkerchief. Kept in a chest and brought out for public veneration only a handful of days each year, Good Friday and the Feast of the Triumph of the Cross among them. Cathedral records trace its arrival in Spain to 614 CE, carried by refugees fleeing the Persian invasion of Jerusalem, transported first to Alexandria and then across North Africa to Toledo, before finally reaching Oviedo. A 6th century pilgrim account by Antoninus of Piacenza, written around 570 C, already describes a cloth of this kind being venerated near Jerusalem decades before the flight to Spain even began. The chest itself, known as the Arca Santa, treated by Asturian kings as a container of the most sacred relics in Christendom, was ceremonially opened before witnesses by King Alfonso II in 840 C. An event the cathedral's own chronicles record by name and date. Unlike the Shroud of Turin, the sudarium carries no image. It carries only blood, sweat, and other bodily fluid stains, spread across its surface in patterns that decades of forensic study have tried to reconstruct into the shape of the face and head it once covered. The sudarium has never been submitted to the kind of radiocarbon dating that produced the medieval date range disputed by Shroud researchers in 1988. No test has ever been run on it that could return a number capable of falsifying the tradition attached to it. That absence cuts 2 ways, and both are worth stating plainly. It means the sudarium carries no scientific date to defend. And it also means it carries no scientific date at all, only an unbroken paper trail of cathedral inventories, and forensic comparisons made against stains rather than fibers. In 1985, forensic pathologist Pierluigi Baima Bellone identified the bloodstains as type AB, a blood group present in roughly 5 to 6% of the modern global population. and documented by researchers as unusually common among the ancient Jewish population of 1st century Jerusalem. Jose Delfin Villalon Blanco, professor of legal medicine at the University of Valencia, conducted an extended forensic hematology study of the cloth beginning in 1994 and published through the Spanish Center for Syndenology. Mapping the stain patterns against a reconstructed model of how a body would have been positioned to produce them, upright and then horizontal, consistent with a body first hanging and then laid flat, blood flowing from wounds around the scalp, consistent with puncture trauma across the crown of the head rather than a single wound. The stain geometry further indicated the body had been face down when the cloth was applied, held in place for a period of time before being removed and folded, a sequence consistent with a body being lowered, wrapped in transit, and unwrapped again before final burial, rather than a single simple covering laid once and left undisturbed. The Gospel of John records that when Peter and John entered the empty tomb, they found the burial linens lying in place, and separately, the cloth that had covered his head, not lying with the other linens but folded by itself. It is a single sentence, easy to read past. The Sudarium of Oviedo is, if its provenance and forensic case hold, a physical candidate for exactly that object. A separate face cloth, handled and folded independently from the larger burial shroud, precisely as the text describes. But here's where the case becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Villalon Blanco's team, and separately, researchers with the Centro Español de Sindonología, compared the Sudarium's bloodstain geometry directly against the bloodstains recorded on the Shroud of Turin. A different cloth, held in a different country, subject to a different chain of custody, and a different contested carbon dating history. The two independent forensic teams found the stain patterns aligning at more than 100 points of correspondence, matching ab blood type, matching wound distribution across the crown, consistent with a circlet of puncture wounds rather than a single injury. Matching evidence of a swollen, contused area on one side of the face. Two objects, two countries, two separate chains of custody spanning centuries, describing, according to the forensic comparison, the same wounds on the same head. For that convergence to be coincidental, the coincidence has to extend past the blood type alone, into the specific geometry of individual wound clusters lining up across two cloths whose custodial histories never once crossed prior to the modern research era, a Spanish cathedral chest opened by kings in the 9th century, and an Italian cathedral vault whose modern custody chain begins only in the 14th. It has to hold even though the Sudarium was never subjected to the same radiocarbon dating controversy that clouds the shroud, because its documented provenance, an unbroken chain of custody traced through cathedral inventories back to the 7th century, already places it centuries before any medieval forgery timeline the shroud's critics have proposed. If the two cloths are unrelated, two independent chains of custody on two different cloths produced matching blood chemistry and matching wound geometry entirely by accident. If they are related, then a face cloth locked in a Spanish cathedral chest and a burial shroud in an Italian vault have spent 13 centuries describing, in blood rather than in text, the same execution. The cloth is still folded inside the Arca Santa tonight, exactly as it has been folded for most of the past 13 centuries. The stains are still type ab. The wound geometry still lines up with a cloth in a different country that no one in Oviedo has ever needed to consult. No carbon date has ever been run. No carbon date is scheduled. The chest closes, the chapel locks, and the face it once covered remains, on paper, unidentified. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.